So we're going to start a new section looking at global governance, and there's a couple different parts to this. One will be international organizations, and the other part will be international law. And we'll try and tackle these together. But I want to begin by laying a foundation, right? That a lot of the course we've been talking about the international system as an anarchic system, right? That everybody's on their own and trying to figure out how to operate in the absence of any sort of, government system that can coordinate action and serve as an international 911 service. And while that's true, that the international system is definitely different than domestic political settings where there are government structures that can do those sort of collective goods kind of things, it would be wrong to suggest that it was sort of a pure anarchic system in which there's no sort of structure to coordinate different actors, right? It's just a different kind of system where norms and rules and a plethora of organizations are much more central to global governance than a central government the way that we would see in a state. And so I think it's also helpful to maybe differentiate between two different types of governance. So we could think about governance the way that we think about it within countries, right? Where there's sort of a hierarchy, right? That the federal government makes rules, and those rules are binding on states, and those rules are binding on the population, but states can also make rules. And so there's sort of this idea that there's a centralized location where rules get made. There's Congress and the presidency, that those rules are sort of universally binding, and there's some sort of structure for making and enforcing those rules. That's not really how global governance works, right? And you could maybe squint and on a good day see the UN system as sort of that, but not really, because there's a lot more going on. There's not really a strong enforcement mechanism, as we'll see later on. A lot of what we have with global governance, however, is much more horizontal. And this is something that I think is really worth keeping in mind, because it can be easy to miss just how much is actually there, because it doesn't look like the kind of governance we see within countries, right? So horizontal governance refers to a decentralized system, right? And so it's not that there's one place where you go to pass laws or make rules. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of different centers that are participating in discussions, working out agreements, coming up with plans, and making rules. So there's the G7 meetings, the G20 meetings, where states come together and figure out how to coordinate action. But then there's also meetings of folks who are, governing riverways, and there's folks who are setting standards for doorknobs for compliance with sort of an international disabilities convention, right? There's all these different centers of decision-making that are going on, and not everybody's involved in all of them, right? Participation is oftentimes voluntary. And so you may have some states that are involved in conversations in one part of the international system that aren't participating in a different situation. And so you could never say that one scenario or one decision-making center is necessarily going to be able to be binding on everybody in that same way, because not everybody's involved in every conversation. No center of power has sort of absolute authority. Instead, what ends up emerging is this sort of network of different entities making decisions and working things out. And it can be very difficult to follow, but what it ends up doing is it allows for states to have sort of maximum flexibility, to participate where they want, to not participate where they want, to coordinate across different networks, not because the networks control the states, but because the states are able to direct resources, link things together, and remain at the center of that decision making. And so it's a type of governance that is hard to see, that is weaker than you would get with hierarchical governance, but is actually really well suited to a system in which you have sovereign states that resist and push back against the idea that some other entity is going to be able to direct them and guide them and impose its will upon them. So I want to shift over to this question about why do we have international organizations? Why do states even bother to build these things in the first place? And there's a couple different stories that we could tell. And I think just conceptually, it's useful to run through these stories. So there's one explanation that focuses on this idea of states creating organizations to serve a purpose, right? That this is the functionalist explanation, right? You got to figure out how you're going to manage the water flow of the Nile River as it crosses across multiple countries. And so you create an international organization where states will meet regularly. There's some permanent staff, and they work out that problem. And that's the problem that they have. There's a need, and an organization is created to respond to that need. So functionalist explanation. Then there's the neo-functionalist explanation, right? And so I think this one works well for the United Nations, right? So the United Nations was created at the end of World War II to essentially provide stability and security for the international system. It essentially gets paralyzed by the Cold War and isn't able to sort of live up to its sort of founding vision. But over the years, within the United Nations systems, people who are employed within that system and states that are working within that system identify new problems and new challenges, things that they can tackle that states might not have recognized initially as a problem. But once the UN comes to them and says, hey, we can create a catalog list of all the world cultural heritage sites so that they don't get blown up in bombing, so that we know that they're being properly maintained, so things don't get lost or destroyed. Would that be helpful? And states kind of shrug and say, oh, actually, that would be helpful. We've never thought to do that before. We never thought that would be something we would want before. But now that you bring it up, that actually seems like a pretty useful thing to do. And so the neo-functionalist explanation says you just create an organization, you throw some resources at it, and people will figure out how to make that organization deliver value. And so we keep these organizations around because they keep finding creative ways to make the international system work a little bit better. And the more capacity that these organizations have, the more they're going to be able to do to continue to prove their usefulness to states. The final explanation that we might toss around is the realist explanation, which says that international organizations are created by states. They are created by states to further their own interests. And the international organizations that exist in the world reflect the power of states. And so at the end of World War II, the United Nations system was created. Every state gets to be a member, but the real power of the United Nations is centered in the Security Council. And the Security Council has the United States, it has Britain, it has France, it has China, it has the Soviet Union. Those 5 countries were the Allied powers in World War II. They were the victors of World War II. Germany and Japan are explicitly forbidden from participating in the Security Council. That gets removed later. But initially, the idea is this will be the power center for the guardians of the international system, the states that won World War II. Another example of this would be the International Monetary Fund, which for years had a set of voting rules that really favored the United States and Europe. And with the Great Recession, the United States put through a series of, or the international community put through a series of changes to voting allocations that would give China greater voice in the International Monetary Fund. The United States has blocked that from coming into effect by refusing to ratify it. And China essentially shrugged and said, that's fine. We don't necessarily need to play with the International Monetary Fund anyway. We'll go and develop our own organization, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, and it'll do similar kind of things. We'll use it to route money to countries to stabilize their financial systems and to help with some economic growth and development. And it'll be a financial institution that we kind of dominate and control, and will be sort of a rival organization to the World Bank and to the International Monetary Fund. And that would be exactly what realists would expect, that powerful states would create organizations that they can control to try to further their interests. And when an organization stops serving the interests of the powerful, they sort of abandon it and walk away and do something else. So when we think about the kind of things that international organizations do, I think it cannot be underestimated how powerful an organization like the United Nations is as a forum for interaction, right? It brings states together that normally wouldn't interact, you know, and I think in the United States, it's sort of assumed that countries have developed diplomatic infrastructure because the United States has consulate and embassies pretty much everywhere on the planet. I think the US just opened up a consulate in Greenland, right? So very wide distributed diplomatic infrastructure. Most countries don't. Most countries have maybe an embassy with their neighbors, maybe an embassy with big powerful states. They've got a spot in DC somewhere, but that might be it. Every country can afford to send one representative to the United Nations to hang out in New York. And so you get folks from Senegal bumping into folks from Costa Rica in the halls of the United Nations and having conversations and discovering that, wow, they actually have a lot of common interests and concerns, being, you know, small countries that, you know, have a coast and rely upon commodity production and are facing challenges with global warming, and they discover that there's these common interests and common concerns, and they start working together and collaborating in a way they never would have before if there wasn't a central place for everybody to send one diplomat to meet. It also works as a forum for solving diplomatic um, as a diplomatic forum that continues to operate even in times of crisis. So one of the first things that happens when states start heading toward war is they shut down their embassies and they pull their people out, right? Which means that your communication options really disappear right at the time when you most desperately need communication to be functioning. But you still have open the New York Channel, right? There's nothing that prevents the United States and North Korea from going out for a coffee in New York and having a UN ambassador from North Korea, a UN ambassador from the United States, conversation about how to resolve a crisis, even if the diplomatic communications don't exist otherwise. So having that forum is really valuable. The other thing international organizations do is that they facilitate cooperation, right? And so a lot of international agreements and international law is made through international organizations, right? When treaties get negotiated, it's oftentimes the UN Secretariat, the central sort of administrative office of the UN that picks the venue and make sure catering is in place and make sure the chairs are set up and the sound system is working and all of the logistics and organizational stuff that go into making these meetings happen. The UN takes care of that and facilitates that oftentimes. The UN and other intergovernmental organizations can also provide a function as oversight and monitoring. And so political scientists are oftentimes, really concerned about this idea of cheating, that states might sign onto agreements, but one state might not, carry through and might gain an advantage, and that this can destabilize cooperation. Well, having an intergovernmental organization that's able to do regular monitoring can be really helpful, right? So we talked with nuclear weapons about the International Atomic Energy Agency that goes around and scrutinizes the nuclear programs of different countries, looks at what they're doing, looks at what they're building, checks under the reactors for things that might be a little fishy and might suggest that there's actually a nuclear weapons program going on. And that helps everybody in the international system feel a greater confidence that everybody's playing by the rules. In fact, political scientists really pound on this as one of the central features of intergovernmental organizations, that they're a neutral party or neutral enough that they're able to provide that assurance and get international agreements to actually work. Intergovernmental organizations can also function to some extent as an independent actor, and these organizations oftentimes have an administrative office, the Secretariat, and the Secretary General of the UN, for example, can to some extent function on his or her own, right? That individual can use the status and bully pulpit of the office of Secretary General of the United Nations to assist with dispute resolution, to function as sort of an honest broker that's able to be trusted to hear all sides and present a fair direction to move forward in. They have a powerful role in hosting conferences and setting agendas for international meetings. And they can put diplomatic pressure on states by calling out states that are maybe not complying with their stated obligations, although that has limits, right? That intergovernmental organizations don't exist in and of themselves. They don't have power in and of themselves. They are created by states and through states, and they continue to operate according to the will of states. And if a head of an intergovernmental organization annoys powerful, important states, that individual can be deposed. States can leave the organization, states can withhold voluntary contributions. So there's a very powerful incentive for the leadership of these organizations to appear legitimate and impartial and to balance the various competing diplomatic demands with a great deal of sensitivity. I should also point out that intergovernmental organizations tend to matter most not with high politics, which is what realists describe security as, right? That your desire to maintain the security of your nation is the thing that's most central to your focus. There's certainly a role for intergovernmental organizations in that they can help to coordinate sanctions, or states will use forums to push for their own interests or policies that they would like to see implemented. But by and large, when the survival of a state is on the line, when security is on the line, states tend to not bind themselves to international organizations in quite the same way that they do with what we might call low politics, which realists sort of dismissively say, oh, it's everything else. It's the stuff states don't really care about, trade or regulations or, travel rules, right? Those are things that it doesn't really matter how they get handled, and therefore international organizations can have a huge influence, right? And so there's lots of situations where the stakes are really low, right? You don't care how a problem gets resolved, but it's really important that it does get resolved. And so I'll give you a couple of different examples of this. One of my favorite is just international air travel. Right, that in order for international air travel to work, you need to make sure that you can always have communication going on between the person in the cockpit and the person on the ground, so that when a plane is crossing, the airspace from one country into another, that there's always the ability for the people on the ground and in the air to communicate with each other. Right, it doesn't matter what language they use to communicate; there just needs to be a language chosen. Right, and so international agreements have come up with English as the language that you have to have, and so an international airport has to have people in the radio control towers that speak English. And any flight that's going to be an international flight has to have a pilot in the cockpit who can speak English, so you can have that communication. Again, it doesn't matter what language it is, right? Stakes are really pretty low. It just matters that we have some sort of agreement that makes sure that planes don't get shut down, right? So that's important. It's really important. In these sorts of situations, states are almost always willing to defer to international organizations and say, figure it out. And, if you can make good things happen, that's great. And so we've had some really successful, amazing accomplishments from international organizations. And so the one I would maybe highlight the most is the eradication of smallpox. Smallpox is a highly infectious disease. It's been a scourge on humanity for almost ever, kills about a third of the folks who contract it, and if you survive it, you're going to be left with really horrific scarring. It's also one of the first diseases that human beings figured out how to stop with vaccinations. But the problem was that we had to keep vaccinating against it because it was out there in circulation. And so in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the international community undertook a substantial effort to eradicate smallpox, and they conducted mass vaccination campaigns around the world, and then sent out teams to go village by village hunting for smallpox with pictures. Have you seen this? Have you seen people like, oh no, not here, but that village over? Yeah, that's happening. And teams would move in and vaccinate the population, and essentially hunted smallpox to extinction. We have a similar kind of success story happening right now with guinea worm, which is a parasite that affects human beings specifically. No other creature gets targeted by guinea worm, but it's just a really horrific creature for human beings. And so it's contracted through water, and if you drink water that's not been treated, the eggs of guinea worm will get into your system, and the guinea worm will grow, and as it matures, it begins burrowing its way out, and when it reaches the surface, it releases a chemical that makes it feel like your limb is on fire. It's horrifically painful, and to stop the pain, I mean, it's excruciating. To stop the pain, you put your arm or your leg or whatever into the water, and that's when it lays its eggs, and the cycle continues. This thing is horrific. To withdraw it, I mean, you have to draw it out with a stick over the course of days or weeks, and it's painful the entire time. And so it's a scourge on humanity. And in the 1990s, there were about 1 million cases a year. And the international community with NGOs and international organizations have systematically hunted this thing. They've pursued water treatment programs. They've developed, little straws that are filtered that you can drink through that will prevent the eggs from being consumed. And country by country has seen the eradication of guinea worms, so that in 2015, there were only 22 cases in the world. And when we get to 0, guinea worm is gone forever. And that is a tremendous improvement in human well-being that was accomplished through international cooperation, through international organizations, and states don't care. Why would any state block this? It's not a threat to anybody's survival or security. It's a handful of dollars thrown at an organization to coordinate an effort to improve human well-being. And so it's those kind of scenarios, right, where there's low threat to the state, but potentially high return for humanity, that international organizations really shine through and have great accomplishments to tout.